The massive breeding caverns of Drakmor echoed with the sounds of hundreds of dragon eggs cracking open. Steam rose from the heated stone floors as powerful hatchlings emerged, their scales gleaming in vibrant reds, deep blues, and emerald greens. Each newborn dragon stretched wings that would one day carry them across star systems, roaring with voices that would shake planets. But in the darkest corner of the cavern, something different stirred. A pale, almost translucent creature struggled from its shell. Where other hatchlings displayed brilliant colors that marked their elemental powers, this one bore scales of pure white, so light they seemed to glow with an inner moonbeam. Its eyes were not the fierce gold or burning amber of its siblings, but a soft pink that many mistook for weakness. The other adult dragons recoiled immediately. Elder Vorthak, the ancient red who oversaw all hatchings, hissed in disgust. "An aberration," he declared, his voice rumbling through the cavern like distant thunder. "The bloodline has been tainted." The albino hatchling, no bigger than a house cat, mewled softly as it tried to approach the others. Every dragon in the cavern turned away. In their society, color meant everything. Red dragons commanded fire that could melt starship hulls. Blue dragons wielded lightning that could power entire cities. Green dragons controlled nature itself, making barren worlds bloom with life. But white? White meant nothing. White was the color of weakness, of genetic failure, of shame. The hatchling was given no name, only turned away from every attempt at contact. When feeding time came, the stronger hatchlings pushed it aside. When the first flying lessons began, no adult would spare it a glance. The creature survived on scraps and learned to hide in the shadows, growing smaller and more fragile, while its siblings grew mighty and strong. Months passed in this cruel isolation. The albino dragon learned to be invisible, to move through the great city of Drakmor without drawing attention. It watched from hidden places as its siblings were chosen by human partners. The ancient bond between dragon and rider that had protected the galaxy for millennia. The sight filled it with a longing so deep it physically hurt. Every dragon was meant to bond with a human. It was their purpose, their destiny, their very reason for existing. Dragons provided the power and strength, while humans offered the emotional connection and tactical thinking that made them unstoppable partners in defending civilized worlds from the endless threats of space. But who would ever choose an albino? Who would want a partner that brought shame instead of pride? The hatchling had almost given up hope when the transport ship arrived from Earth. These were not the usual candidates, experienced pilots and warriors who came seeking dragon partners. Instead, these were refugees, families fleeing from a colony world that had been destroyed by the Void Swarm, those terrible creatures from the dark spaces between galaxies that consumed everything in their path. Among them was a small human girl named Maya, no more than 8 years old. She had lost everything in the attack, her parents, her home, her entire world. The dragons had rescued her ship at the last moment, bringing the survivors to Drakmor for safety while new homes were arranged. Maya wandered the great halls of the Dragon City with eyes that had seen too much. The other children stayed close to the adults, frightened by the massive creatures that surrounded them. But Maya seemed drawn to explore, perhaps seeking something to fill the emptiness inside her. She discovered the albino dragon in an abandoned chamber, huddled behind a fallen piece of ancient architecture. The creature was thin and weak, its scales dull from malnutrition and neglect. When Maya approached, it didn't flee like it usually did from others. Instead, it looked up at her with those strange pink eyes, and something passed between them. Maya had never seen a dragon so beautiful. To her young eyes, untrained in the rigid hierarchies of dragon society, the albino's scales looked like fresh snow touched by starlight. She had no idea that this creature was considered an outcast, a failure, something to be ashamed of. All she saw was something that looked as lost and alone as she felt. Without hesitation, without fear, Maya knelt down and gently kissed the dragon's forehead. The moment their connection formed, everything changed. Light exploded from the albino dragon's scales. Not the harsh fire of reds or the crackling energy of blues, but something entirely new. Pure energy, raw and primal, flowed through both of them. Maya gasped as knowledge flooded her mind. Not just the surface thoughts of her new partner, but deep, ancient memories that belonged to dragonkind itself. She saw the truth that even the elder dragons had forgotten. The albino scales were not a sign of weakness, but of something far more powerful and dangerous than any of them had imagined. This dragon was not failed or broken. It was evolution itself, the next step in their species' development, and in that moment of connection, as girl and dragon bonded in ways that defied everything the dragon elders thought they knew, alarms began to sound throughout the city. The Void Swarm had found Drakmor, and they were coming in numbers greater than ever before seen. The real test was about to begin. The Void Swarm descended upon Drakmor like a living nightmare made of shadow and hunger. From space, they looked like a dark cloud that swallowed starlight itself. But up close, they were far worse. Each creature was the size of a battleship, with bodies that seemed to be made of liquid darkness wrapped around cores of twisted metal and bone. They had no eyes, no mouth that could be seen, but they radiated an emptiness that made even the bravest warriors feel sick with fear. Elder Vorthak stood on the highest tower of the Dragon City, his massive red form outlined against the approaching doom. Around him, hundreds of adult dragons prepared for battle, their riders checking weapons and equipment with practiced efficiency. The sight should have been inspiring. Dragons and humans working together as they had for thousands of years, ready to defend their home against impossible odds. But Vorthak knew the truth that none of the others wanted to admit. The Void Swarm was stronger than ever before. Intelligence reports from the outer worlds painted a grim picture. Entire star systems had gone dark. Military fleets that could have destroyed planets vanished without sending so much as a distress signal. Whatever these creatures were, they were evolving, learning, becoming more dangerous with each world they consumed. Down in the abandoned chamber, Maya held her dragon close as the sounds of preparation echoed through the stone halls. The creature had grown in the minutes since their bonding, but not in the way dragon hatchlings usually did. Instead of gaining size and muscle, it seemed to become more solid, more real, as if their connection was pulling it into full existence for the first time. "What's your name?" Maya whispered, running her small hands over scales that felt warm and cool at the same time. The dragon's response came not in words, but in images and feelings that flowed directly into her mind. She saw vast spaces between stars, places where light had never touched, ancient powers that slept in the deep cold of space. She felt the loneliness of being different, of being rejected by those who should have understood, and underneath it all she sensed a strength that made her gasp. "Stellaris," she said finally, the name forming in her mind like a half-remembered dream. "Your name is Stellaris." The dragon, Stellaris, hummed with pleasure at finally having an identity beyond shame and rejection. But their quiet moment was shattered as the chamber door burst open. 3 dragon riders in full battle gear stood there, their expressions hard with purpose. "All civilians to the deep shelters," the lead rider commanded. "This is not a place for children." Maya stood up, still keeping one hand on Stellaris's neck. "We want to help." The riders laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Help? Child, you have no idea what's coming. The Void Swarm has never attacked a dragon stronghold directly before. They're not just hungry anymore, they're organized, tactical. We've lost contact with 6 colony worlds in the past week. Each attack was more coordinated than the last. As if summoned by his words, the first void creatures smashed into Drakmor's outer shields. The entire city shook as defensive systems that had never been tested against a real assault suddenly blazed to life. Energy barriers flared across the sky, weapons platforms rotated to track incoming threats, and the great warning horns sounded across every district. But the shields, designed to stop conventional attacks, barely slowed the Void Swarm down. The creatures seemed to slip through energy barriers like they weren't there, their dark forms rippling and changing as they descended toward the city proper. Maya felt Stellaris tense beneath her hand. Images flashed through their mental link, not fear but recognition. Somehow her dragon knew these creatures, not personally but in the way that predator recognizes prey or prey recognizes predator. "We have to go," Maya said, her young voice carrying a certainty that made the adult riders pause. "Stellaris can help. I can feel it." "Stellaris?" The lead rider looked at the albino dragon with obvious disdain. "That's not even a proper dragon. Look at it. No fire, no lightning, no elemental power at all. What could it possibly do against the Void Swarm?" But before Maya could answer, the first wave of void creatures reached the city's inner defenses. Through the chamber's high windows, they could see dragons rising to meet the attack, their riders guiding them in complex aerial maneuvers that had been perfected over centuries of warfare. Fire bloomed in the sky as red dragons unleashed their fury. Lightning crackled from the blues, while green sent vines and thorns rising from every available surface to entangle the approaching enemies. For a moment, it looked like the defense might hold. Then the void creatures began to adapt. Maya watched in horror as the dark entities started absorbing the dragon's attacks. Fire that should have burned them to ash was swallowed up and made them stronger. Lightning that should have shattered their forms was redirected back at the dragons themselves. Even the nature magic of the green seemed to twist and corrupt in their presence, turning healing plants into strangling weeds. 3 dragons fell from the sky in the first minute of battle. Their riders managed to escape, but the creatures themselves were pulled into the writhing mass of darkness and simply disappeared. Not destroyed, but consumed, made part of the swarm's ever-growing hunger. Elder Vorthak's voice boomed across the city's communication system, carried by the same mental networks that connected all dragons to their riders. All units fall back to defensive positions. Do not engage directly. Repeat, do not engage the Void Swarm in direct combat, but it was already too late. More dragons were falling, and with each loss, the swarm grew stronger. Maya could feel their hunger like a physical weight pressing down on her mind. They didn't just want to destroy Drakmor. They wanted to understand it, to learn from it, to take everything that made dragons and humans strong and turn it into part of their own twisted existence. That's when Stellaris stepped forward, moving to the chamber's main window. The albino dragon was no longer the weak, frightened hatchling that had been rejected by its own kind. Something fundamental had changed during the bonding with Maya, and now it stood with confidence that seemed to radiate from its pale scales. Maya felt her partner's intentions through their link and climbed onto Stellaris's back without hesitation. The dragon riders shouted protests, but they were already moving, launching themselves from the window into the chaotic sky above Drakmor. The moment they entered the battle, everything changed again. The void creatures that had been overwhelming the other dragons suddenly turned toward them with what could only be described as recognition, and for the first time since the attack began, they seemed afraid. Stellaris flew through the chaos with a grace that defied physics. Where other dragons had to fight against the Void Swarm's corrupting influence, the albino dragon moved as if the darkness itself was clearing a path. Maya clung to her partner's neck, feeling the incredible power flowing through both of them as they soared between falling debris and panicked retreat formations. Below them, Elder Vorthak was rallying what remained of the dragon forces near the great central spire. His massive red form was scarred from multiple encounters with void creatures, and his mental voice carried exhaustion and desperation as he coordinated the failing defense. Unknown rider, identify yourself and fall back to Rally Point 7, his command echoed in Maya's mind. This is no place for unauthorized flights. But Maya wasn't listening to radio chatter anymore. Through her link with Stellaris, she was seeing something that none of the other defenders could perceive. The Void Swarm wasn't just randomly attacking. They were following patterns, ancient roots that connected to something much larger and more dangerous than anyone realized. Each void creature was like a single cell in a vast organism that stretched across multiple star systems. What looked like separate attacks on different worlds were actually coordinated strikes by a single, massive intelligence. And that intelligence was looking for something specific on Drakmor, something that had been hidden here for thousands of years. Stellaris showed her the truth through shared memories that seemed to come from the dragon species' deepest genetic archives. Long before the current civilization, before humans and dragons had formed their partnership, there had been another war against the void. The first dragons, the ancestors of all modern species, had fought a desperate battle against the same enemy that was attacking now. They had won, but at a terrible cost. The victory had required a sacrifice so great that the surviving dragons had deliberately forgotten it, burying the memory so deep that only genetic throwbacks like Stellaris could still access them. The albino dragons weren't mutations or failures. They were guardians, created specifically to remember what others had chosen to forget. Their pale scales weren't a sign of weakness. They were a mark of responsibility, a reminder of powers too dangerous to use except in the most desperate circumstances. And those circumstances had arrived. Maya felt Stellaris gathering energy as they dove toward the largest concentration of void creatures. But this wasn't the fire of reds or the lightning of blues. This was something that existed in the spaces between elements, a force that could reach into the fundamental structure of reality itself and make changes. The first void creature they encountered was the size of a city block, its dark mass writhing with stolen power from the dragons it had already consumed. When Stellaris breathed on it, the creature didn't burn or freeze or get struck by lightning. Instead, it simply stopped existing. Not destroyed, not killed, but completely removed from reality as if it had never been there at all. The space where it had been floating showed clear sky and distant stars, with no trace that anything had ever occupied that location. The effect rippled outward from their position. Other void creatures that had been adapting to dragon attacks suddenly found themselves vulnerable again. The stolen powers they had absorbed began to turn against them, no longer fitting properly into their alien biology. Down in the city, dragons that had been forced into retreat suddenly found their abilities working again. Fire burned clean and hot, lightning struck with precision, and nature magic began to heal the damage that had been done to Drakmor's defensive systems. But Elder Vorthak was too experienced to miss the implications of what he was seeing. As Stellaris and Maya continued their impossible flight through the heart of the enemy formation, his ancient mind raced through possibilities that chilled him to his massive bones. He had heard legends of the albino dragons, stories so old they were usually dismissed as mythology. But if those stories were true, then what Maya and her partner were doing came with a price that might be too terrible to pay. The power to unmake reality was not something that could be used safely. Every time Stellaris erased a void creature from existence, there was a chance that something else might be erased as well. The boundary between enemy and ally, between threat and innocent, became meaningless when dealing with forces that operated outside normal physics. Vorthak opened a direct mental channel to Maya, pushing past her partner's protective barriers with authority that came from millennia of experience. "Child, you must stop. The power you're using is not meant for this reality. Each time your dragon unmakes an enemy, you risk unmaking everything else as well." But Maya's response carried a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone her age. "I know the risks, Elder Vorthak. Stellaris has shown me the old memories. But look around you, how many of your warriors are left? How many more will die if we don't take this chance?" The brutal truth was impossible to ignore. The dragon forces were down to less than half strength, and the void swarm was still growing larger with each passing minute. Traditional warfare was failing against an enemy that could adapt to any attack and turn their own weapons against them. As if sensing the debate between dragon and rider, the void swarm suddenly changed tactics. Instead of spreading out across the city, all remaining creatures began to converge on a single location, the deepest vaults beneath Drakmor's central spire, where the dragon archives stored their most ancient and dangerous artifacts. Maya felt Stellaris' alarm through their link. Whatever the void creatures were seeking in those vaults, it was something that even her partner's reality-altering powers might not be able to stop. The convergence was creating a massive dark vortex that was beginning to tear holes in space itself, reaching towards something that had been safely buried for thousands of years. "They're not just invading," Maya whispered, understanding flooding through her. "They're excavating. They know something is down there, something that was hidden after the last war." Elder Vorthak's voice carried new urgency as he reached the same conclusion. The heart of void. It was a weapon created during the First War, something that could turn reality itself against our enemies. We thought it was destroyed, but if it was only hidden, the implications hit them all at once. The Void Swarm wasn't trying to conquer Drakmor or consume its defenders. They were trying to reclaim a weapon that had originally been built using their own essence, a tool that would give them power over the fundamental forces that held the universe together. And they were less than minutes away from reaching it. Stellaris banked hard toward the convergence point, carrying Maya into the heart of darkness itself. If they were going to prevent a catastrophe that could unravel reality across multiple galaxies, they would have to reach the ancient vaults first and face whatever had been sleeping there since the end of the last war. Neither of them was prepared for what they would find waiting in the depths below. The ancient vaults beneath Drakmor had been sealed for good reason. As Stellaris and Maya descended through layers of stone and metal that grew progressively older and stranger, the very air around them began to change. What had started as normal atmosphere gradually became something thicker, heavier, charged with energies that made Maya's skin tingle, and her dragon partner's scales glow with increasing brightness. The void creatures had carved a tunnel through solid rock, their passage leaving behind walls that looked like they had been melted and reformed by forces that didn't quite follow natural laws. The tunnel spiraled downward in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, as if the geometry itself was somehow wrong. Maya pressed herself closer to Stellaris's neck as they flew deeper into the excavated passage. Through their mental link, she could feel her partner's growing unease. These depths held memories that even the albino dragon's ancient genetic knowledge couldn't fully process. Fragments of events so traumatic that they had been deliberately sealed away not just from history, but from possibility itself. They emerged into a vast chamber that defied the physical structure of the city above. The space was far too large to exist within Drakmore's foundations, stretching away into darkness that seemed to have depth and substance. Ancient machinery lined the walls, devices built from materials that shifted, between metal and stone and something that might have been crystallized. Time. At the center of the chamber sat the heart of Void. Maya had expected something dramatic, a weapon that looked dangerous, technology that radiated obvious power. Instead, she found herself staring at what appeared to be a simple sphere of polished black stone, no larger than her head, floating a few feet above a pedestal carved from the same wrong-angle geometry as the tunnel above. But appearances were deceiving. The moment her eyes focused on the sphere, Maya felt reality bend around it. The heart wasn't just made of darkness. It was a concentrated point where the absence of existence had been given form and purpose. Looking at it was like staring into the space between spaces, the nothingness that separated one moment from the next. Stellaris landed beside the pedestal, and immediately Maya understood why the Void Swarm wanted this artifact so desperately. Through her dragon's enhanced perception, she could see the connections radiating out from the heart like invisible threads. Each thread led to a different point in space and time, linking the artifact to every place where the Void had ever touched reality. The sphere wasn't just a weapon. It was a key that could unlock every boundary between existence and nothingness, allowing the Void to spread across all possible realities simultaneously. With it in their possession, the Swarm wouldn't need to conquer worlds one by one. They could simply unmake the concept of existence itself. The ancestors didn't destroy it, Maya whispered, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. They couldn't destroy it because it was made from something that exists outside destruction. Stellaris's response came in the form of shared knowledge pulled from the deepest genetic memories. The first war against the Void had lasted for thousands of years, with dragons and their human partners fighting desperately against an enemy that grew stronger with each victory. In the end, the only solution had been to create a weapon using the enemy's own essence. But doing so had required a sacrifice that nearly destroyed dragonkind itself. The albino dragons hadn't been born as guardians. They had been created through a process that stripped away all elemental associations, all connections to the normal forces of reality, leaving them as perfect voids that could contain and control the heart's power. But using that power came with a cost that was almost too terrible to pay. Each time an albino dragon channeled the heart's energy, they gave up a piece of their own existence. Not their life, but their reality itself. They became less real, less solid, less able to affect the normal world around them. The original Guardians had saved the galaxy by gradually fading out of existence entirely, taking the knowledge of the heart's location with them. Only Stellaris remained, hidden among the regular dragons and forgotten by history, waiting for the day when the Void would return and the terrible choice would have to be made. Again, the chamber suddenly filled with the sound of tearing reality as the first Void creatures broke through into the ancient vault. They moved differently here, no longer the chaotic swarm they had been above ground. In the presence of the heart, they showed their true nature, fragments of a single vast intelligence that operated according to laws that predated the current universe. Maya felt their hunger like a physical weight pressing down on her mind. But it wasn't the simple desire to consume that she had sensed before. These creatures were desperate, driven by something that might have been fear if it had been experienced by any normal form of life. Through Stellaris's enhanced perception, she began to understand. The Void Swarm wasn't from this reality. They were refugees from a universe that had already ended, survivors from a cosmos where existence itself had broken down. They weren't trying to destroy everything. They were trying to escape into a reality where they could continue to exist, but their very presence was toxic to normal space-time. Everywhere they went, they brought the decay and dissolution that had destroyed their original universe. They couldn't help it any more than fire could help burning or water could help being wet. It was simply their nature. The heart of void had been their attempt to find a solution. If they could control the boundary between existence and nothingness, they might be able to create spaces where they could survive without destroying everything around them. But the weapon had been lost in the war, and they had spent millennia searching through the cosmos for any trace of its presence. Now they were so close to their goal that Maya could feel their anticipation like electricity in the air. The largest of the creatures, something that might once have been comparable to Elder Vorthak in size and power, extended tendrils of living darkness toward the floating sphere. That's when Stellaris stepped forward, placing himself between the heart and the approaching void creature. The albino dragon's scales began to glow with that strange inner light, and Maya felt power building between them that made her earlier experiences seem like gentle breezes compared to a hurricane. But before they could act, the chamber filled with the sound of another arrival. Elder Vorthak burst through the tunnel opening, his massive red form accompanied by a dozen of the most experienced dragon riders on Drakmor. They took in the scene with trained eyes: the ancient chamber, the floating artifact, the approaching void creatures, and the small girl on an albino dragon standing directly in the path of forces that could unravel reality itself. "Stand down, child," Vorthak commanded, his mental voice carrying absolute authority. "This is beyond any of us now. The weapon must be destroyed even if it takes this entire system with it." But Maya had seen something in the void creature's desperate hunger that the older dragons had missed. There was another solution, one that didn't require choosing between existence and nothingness. It would require trust, sacrifice, and a leap of faith that went against everything the dragon elders had been taught about their ancient enemies. And it would require her to make a choice that no 8-year-old should ever have to face. Maya slid down from Stellaris's back and walked toward the heart of void, with steps that seemed impossibly steady for a child facing the end of everything. The sphere pulsed with dark energy that made the air around it shimmer like heat waves, but she felt no fear. Through her bond with Stellaris, she had access to genetic memories that stretched back to the very beginning of the war, and those memories had shown her something that everyone else had missed. "You don't understand," she said, her young voice somehow carrying clearly through the vast chamber, despite the crackling energy and the sounds of approaching void creatures. "They're not our enemies. They never were." Elder Vorthak's massive head swung toward her, golden eyes blazing with disbelief. "Child, those creatures have destroyed countless worlds. They have consumed entire civilizations. How can you possibly say they are not our enemies?" But Maya was already reaching out toward the largest void creature, the one that had been extending tendrils toward the heart. The moment her small hand touched the surface of its dark form, everything changed. The creature didn't consume her or corrupt her as everyone expected. Instead, it stopped moving entirely as if her touch had frozen it in place. Then slowly, carefully, it began to pull back its tendrils and reshape itself into something less threatening. Through her connection with Stellaris, Maya had learned to perceive reality the way albino dragons did, not as solid matter and energy, but as patterns of existence and non-existence flowing together. From that perspective, the void creatures looked completely different. They weren't monsters driven by hunger. They were broken beings desperately trying to hold themselves together in a reality that was fundamentally incompatible with their nature. "They're dying," Maya explained, still maintaining contact with the creature's dark surface. "Their universe ended billions of years ago. They've been fleeing through the void between realities ever since, looking for somewhere they could exist without destroying everything around them." The void creature responded to her words with a vibration that carried meaning directly into her mind. Images flashed between them, a cosmos filled with impossible beauty, where darkness and light existed in perfect harmony. Then came the corruption, the slow dissolution of natural laws, the desperate flight as reality itself began to unravel. Finally, the endless journey through the spaces between universes, watching their own kind fade away one by one as they lost cohesion in the hostile environment of normal spacetime. Maya turned back to Elder Vorthak and the assembled dragon riders, her eyes bright with understanding. The Heart of Void wasn't built as a weapon. It was built as a bridge. The first dragons and humans created it to find a way to help the Void survivors exist in our reality, without destroying it. Vorthak's expression shifted from disbelief to something approaching horror. "That's impossible. The historical records are clear. The Void Swarm was our enemy. They attacked our worlds, consumed our people. Because they had no choice. Stellaris spoke for the first time, his mental voice carrying harmonics that made everyone in the chamber stop and listen. When beings of pure dissolution encounter beings of solid existence, conflict is inevitable. But conflict doesn't mean the situation is permanent. The albino dragon moved to stand beside Maya, his pale scales now glowing so brightly that they illuminated the entire chamber. Through their bond, Maya could feel him preparing to do something that would fundamentally change both of them forever. The original plan worked, Stellaris continued. The first Guardians succeeded in creating a stable interface between our reality and theirs. But the process required the Guardians to sacrifice their own existence, becoming permanent bridges between the two states of being. Maya understood what her partner was proposing, and the implications took her breath away. The albino dragons hadn't disappeared because they had used up their reality fighting the void. They had chosen to become something new, existing simultaneously in both states of being, serving as living connections that allowed void survivors to exist peacefully in normal space. But the knowledge had been lost when the remaining dragons, traumatized by the war and the loss of their guardians, had decided to bury the entire experience. They had convinced themselves that the void swarm had been defeated rather than face the truth that their victory had required their companions to sacrifice their very existence. The heart contains the consciousness of every albino dragon that made the transition, Maya whispered, finally understanding why the artifact had seemed familiar when she first saw it. They're all still in there, maintaining the bridge between realities. Elder Vorthak's voice carried new respect, but also deep concern. And you're proposing to join them? To give up your existence in this reality in order to create a permanent solution. Maya looked around the chamber at the void creatures that had stopped their advance, waiting to see what choice would be made. Then she looked at the dragon riders who had dedicated their lives to protecting the galaxy from threats they didn't fully understand. Finally, she looked at Stellaris, her partner and friend, who was offering to sacrifice everything to create a better solution. Not just me, she said quietly. Us, together. The bond between dragon and rider is what makes this possible. Neither humans nor dragons could do it alone, but together we can create something that bridges both realities. The largest void creature moved closer, its form gradually becoming more solid and defined as it prepared to merge with the heart's energy matrix. Through her contact with it, Maya could sense others throughout the galaxy. Void survivors who had been hiding in the spaces between stars, waiting for word that a permanent solution had been found. There were thousands of them, perhaps millions scattered across multiple star systems, all of them refugees from a dead universe, all of them desperately trying to survive without destroying the reality that had given them shelter. But there was something else in the creature's consciousness, something that made Maya's heart race with possibility rather than fear. The void survivors weren't just looking for a place to exist safely. They had knowledge, technology, understanding of cosmic forces that could advance civilization by millions of years. If the bridge could be established, if humans and dragons and void survivors could coexist peacefully, the resulting partnership would create something unprecedented in galactic history. 3 different forms of existence working together, sharing knowledge and capabilities that none of them possessed alone. The choice wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about creating a future that would be better for everyone. Maya reached out and took hold of the heart of void, feeling its dark energy flow through her fingers and into her connection with Stellaris. The albino dragon added his own power to the mix, and suddenly the chamber filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. The moment Maya's fingers closed around the heart of void, reality exploded into something beyond description. The chamber, the ancient machinery, even the solid stone walls became fluid, shifting between states of existence that had no names in any language. Maya felt herself stretching across dimensions she hadn't known existed, her consciousness expanding to encompass viewpoints that belonged to creatures of pure thought and beings of crystallized time. Through it all, Stellaris remained her anchor. The albino dragon's presence in her mind was like a steady flame in an infinite darkness, guiding her through the transition that was rewriting the fundamental nature of what they were becoming together. Elder, Vorthak, and the other dragon riders watched, in awe and terror as the girl and her partner began to glow with an inner light that seemed to come from the spaces between atoms. Maya's physical form was becoming translucent, but instead of fading away, she was becoming more complex, more multidimensional, existing simultaneously in the normal reality they all knew, and in the twisted space-time where the Void survivors had been hiding. The largest Void creature moved closer to the transformation, its dark tendrils interweaving with the energy patterns flowing between Maya and Stellaris. As the three forms of existence began to merge, something extraordinary happened. The creature's chaotic darkness began to take on structure and purpose, while Maya and Stellaris gained access to knowledge that spanned the history of multiple universes. Suddenly, Maya could see the galaxy from perspectives that had been impossible moments before. She perceived the hidden spaces between star systems where reality was thin, the quantum foam that connected all points in space and time, the vast networks of energy that linked every living thing across billions of light years. But more importantly, she could see the other Void survivors scattered throughout known space. They had been hiding in asteroid fields, in the hearts of dead stars, in the gaps between dimensions, waiting desperately for some sign that they would not have to spend eternity as refugees in a reality that slowly poisoned them with its fundamental incompatibility. Through the heart of Void, Maya sent out a signal that traveled faster than light, faster than thought, reaching every hidden survivor in a matter of seconds. The message was simple but carried infinite complexity. The bridge was being rebuilt, the interface between realities was becoming stable, and they could finally come home. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the galaxy, Void survivors began to emerge from their hiding places. No longer the chaotic swarm that had attacked Drakmor, but beings of incredible sophistication and beauty. They moved in formations that followed mathematical principles unknown to normal space, their dark forms revealing patterns of stunning elegance as they shed the desperate camouflage that had hidden their true nature. Elder Vorthak's voice reached Maya through the transforming energies, carrying wonder and growing understanding. "Child, what are you becoming?" Maya's response came not in words but in shared experience. Suddenly, every dragon and rider in the chamber could perceive reality as she was learning to see it. They experienced the universe as a vast interconnected web, where different forms of existence could coexist without conflict, where the boundaries between matter and energy, between thought and reality, became fluid and negotiable. Through this new perception, they could see that the Void survivors possessed technologies that operated on principles of controlled dissolution and reformation. They could manipulate matter at the quantum level, travel between dimensions, and access forms of energy that existed in the spaces between normal particles. But they had been unable to use these abilities safely in normal reality because their very presence destabilized the atomic structures that physical matter depended upon. They needed the bridge that beings like Maya and Stellaris could provide, conscious entities that existed in both states simultaneously, serving as living translators between incompatible forms of existence. As the transformation continued, Maya felt her awareness expanding even further. She could sense the ancient albino dragons who had made this choice millennia ago, their consciousness preserved within the heart's quantum matrix. They welcomed her with joy and relief, no longer alone in their eternal vigil between realities. But they also shared their knowledge of what came next. The bridge was only the beginning. Once established, it would allow for unprecedented cooperation between humans, dragons, and Void survivors. Technologies that each species had developed in isolation could be combined and improved through their different approaches to manipulating reality. Dragons, with their mastery of elemental forces, could provide the power and stability needed for large-scale projects. Humans, with their adaptability and innovative thinking, could serve as coordinators and problem solvers. Void survivors, with their understanding of space-time manipulation, could open up possibilities that neither of the other species had ever imagined. Together, they could solve problems that had plagued civilization for millennia. Faster than light travel would become routine. The energy needs of entire star systems could be met through careful manipulation of quantum foam. Even death itself might become negotiable, as consciousness could be preserved and transferred between different states of existence. Maya felt herself reaching a critical point in the transformation. Soon she would complete the transition and become a permanent bridge between realities. She would still be herself, still be connected to Stellaris, but she would also be something entirely new, a hybrid form of existence that could serve as an interface between incompatible universes. But before she took that final step, she reached out one last time to Elder Vorthak and the assembled dragon riders. Through their mental link, she shared one final revelation that changed everything they thought they knew about their own history. The partnership between dragons and humans hadn't been a natural development. It had been inspired by the example of the first albino dragons and their void partners, beings who had learned to bridge different forms of existence through bonds of trust and shared purpose. Every dragon rider pair was unconsciously following a pattern established by the ancient guardians, creating small-scale versions of the reality bridge that was now being rebuilt on a galactic scale. This was why the bond between dragon and rider was so powerful, why it allowed them to achieve things that neither species could accomplish alone. They were tapping into fundamental forces that connected all forms of consciousness across the barriers between different types of reality. With this understanding, the transformation reached its completion. Maya and Stellaris became something unprecedented, a conscious bridge between universes, a living interface that would allow billions of beings to coexist in harmony despite their fundamental differences. And throughout the galaxy, the age of cooperation between three incompatible forms of existence was finally beginning. 10 years after the transformation at Drakmor, the galaxy had become something that none of its inhabitants could have imagined. Maya and Stellaris, now existing as a conscious bridge between realities, had made possible achievements that rewrote the fundamental understanding of what civilization could accomplish. The first change had been the establishment of interface cities, massive orbital stations where beings of all three existence types could interact safely. These weren't just trading posts or diplomatic centers, but living communities where families could include members from different realities. Children grew up speaking languages that incorporated quantum mathematics alongside traditional words, learning to perceive the universe from multiple dimensional perspectives simultaneously. In these cities, Void survivors worked alongside human engineers and dragon crafters to build technologies that seemed like magic to earlier generations. Starships that could travel between galaxies in minutes by folding space-time through calculated dissolution points, healing chambers that could repair damage at the cellular level by temporarily converting injured tissue into energy patterns and rebuilding it without flaws, communication networks that operated through quantum entanglement, allowing instantaneous contact across unlimited distances. But the most remarkable changes were happening to the people themselves. Children born in the interface cities possessed abilities that their parents had never dreamed possible. They could perceive reality from multiple viewpoints simultaneously, shifting their consciousness between states of existence as easily as changing clothes. Some could communicate directly with matter at the atomic level, convincing molecules to rearrange themselves into new configurations. Others could step partially outside normal time, moving through events that others experienced as fixed sequences. Maya, still recognizable as the 8-year-old girl who had kissed an albino dragon hatchling, but now existing across multiple dimensional layers, served as a guide and teacher for these hybrid children. Through her connection with Stellaris and the network of consciousness bridges that had grown throughout the galaxy, she helped them understand their expanding abilities while maintaining connection to their humanity. Elder Vorthak, now ancient even by dragon standards, had become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the new reality. His massive red form could often be seen in the interface cities, working with void craftsmen to create architectural projects that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The old warrior had discovered that his elemental fire could be combined with void dissolution, techniques to create controlled fusion reactions that provided clean energy for entire star systems. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some groups of humans and dragons had initially resisted the changes, fearing that their traditional identities would be lost in the new hybrid civilization. But time had proven that cooperation enhanced rather than diminished what made each species unique. Dragons were still dragons with their pride and elemental mastery intact. Humans remained adaptable and innovative. And void survivors had finally found peace after eons of desperate flight. More importantly, the galaxy had become safer than it had ever been in recorded history. The old threats that had plagued civilization for millennia, pirates, hostile alien species, resource wars, and natural disasters, had become manageable problems with solutions that drew on the combined knowledge of all three existence types. When aggressive alien fleets approached inhabited systems, Void survivors could simply dissolve their weapons while Dragon Rider teams provided precision strikes that disabled rather than destroyed. Pirates found their stolen goods literally ceasing to exist when they tried to fence them in cities protected by interface bridges. Natural disasters could be prevented or redirected by carefully manipulating the quantum foundations of space-time in the affected regions. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about consciousness itself. The old boundaries between life and death, between individual and collective existence, had become fluid and negotiable. Beings could choose to merge temporarily for specific projects, sharing knowledge and abilities across species lines. Death was no longer permanent, as consciousness could be preserved in quantum matrices and restored to new forms when desired. Maya often reflected on the irony that the greatest advances in galactic civilization had come from what everyone had originally seen as a failure. The albino dragon that no one had wanted, the refugee child with no home, the ancient weapon that was really a tool for peace. All of them had been dismissed or feared until the moment when crisis revealed their true value. Through her expanded consciousness, she could perceive the ripple effects of their transformation spreading beyond their own galaxy. Other civilizations in distant regions of the universe were detecting the quantum signatures of the interface bridges and sending investigation teams to learn how such cooperation had been achieved. Some of these visitors brought news of other refugee species, survivors from cosmic disasters who had been wandering the void between galaxies for millions of years. Each new contact brought fresh possibilities for expansion and growth. The principles that had allowed humans, dragons, and void survivors to coexist could be adapted to bridge other incompatible forms of existence. Maya could envision a future where the entire universe might be connected by a network of conscious bridges, allowing every form of life to contribute its unique perspective and abilities to the growing community of existence. Stellaris, still her partner and closest friend despite their transformation into something beyond traditional categories, shared her vision of what they were building together. Through their eternal bond, they had learned that love and trust were universal constants that could bridge any gap, connect any differences, and overcome any obstacle. The little girl who had kissed an unwanted dragon had grown into something that transcended species and reality itself. But at her core, she remained what she had always been, someone who saw potential where others saw failure, who offered friendship where others showed fear, and who believed that every being deserved a chance to find their place in the vast community of existence. And throughout the galaxy, in interface cities where impossible beings lived together in harmony, children who existed in multiple realities simultaneously would gather to hear the story of Maya and Stellaris, learning that the greatest transformations often begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that the universe is always larger and more welcoming than fear would have us believe. The age of bridges had begun, and there was no limit to what could be built when beings chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, and love over prejudice.